everyone. We're so excited to be here and so excited to be on the forum stage. We really have, an all-star panel here to talk about the subject of building trust in the age of disinformation. We have business, we have government, we have a think tank, we have all of it here. And so just want to dive right in. Don't forget, if you want to submit questions via Slido, I'll try to get to them if I can. So I want to start. A lot of people blame things, or people, like Donald Trump, or like the people behind Brexit, for the cause and the rise of disinformation. But haven't we always distrusted institutions? Is this anything new? And what do you think?
Well, first of all, I think we need to understand that what is going on right now is really very much a downright attack, particularly on democracies. It's true that disinformation has always existed, but social media is really like steroids for disinformation, because it can now spread so incredibly fast. And the goal is, of course, complete disorientation. You don't know anymore what's right, what's wrong, who's telling the truth, can I trust, can I not trust? And it's very corrosive to democracies in particular, because our political system is based on trust, based on the belief that public officials, no matter whether they're on the right or left, ultimately have the common good in focus. And I think this is very much questioned right now.
Margot, we've seen polls that trust in governments have fallen in the US down to 33% of the population, in the UK 36% of the population. What do you see in your work? We were talking just the other day about the Information Commissioner's report about social media companies and private data and how people might have not realized that their data was being used in other ways. What are you seeing in your work right now, and what are you doing to help combat this disinformation?
Well, in the UK, I guess because the Cambridge Analytica and Facebook manipulation of data occurred under our watch, so to speak, we're very alive to the concerns, and I must pay tribute to the UK's Information Commissioner. She has used her powers very effectively and produced a report, and the recommendations we are taking extremely seriously. I think that there is a view that if we do some common sense things like apply the same rules and regulations that apply offline in the world of political campaigning to the online environment, that will be sufficient. For me, that will be a necessary first step, but in and of itself, it will not be enough of a solution, because so much of this political campaigning online is not undertaken and paid for by official political parties. That does exist, and that will be relatively easy to regulate online as it has been offline. But there's an enormous amount of, essentially, propaganda that is circulated by individual supporters and small groups within political parties without the sanction of the political parties. And I think we need to come to terms with some solutions that will apply to that sort of thing, as well as official party campaigning. I mean, there's plenty more I can say, but limited time, and we want to hear from John, so...
Right, and I definitely want to circle back on the fines and what governments can do. But John, you come from the private world. You advise businesses. Where do you think we stand on this issue of trust? We've actually seen polls that more people trust businesses and they trust CEOs than they might the institutions. Do you see that reflected, and how do you advise the companies that you work with when it comes to trust in an age of disinformation?
Well, I agree. I think we're seeing so much research that's now confirming for us that there's a huge erosion in trust in our politicians, our leaders in public life. And what is happening everywhere is consumers are demanding that companies stand up and say what they stand for. And it's also happening among employees too. I mean, we saw it very graphically only last week within Google, of the protest that they had there in terms of Me Too. So that's a very fundamental change, because I think in the DNA of most business people, and I dare say so many people in the audience today, one would prefer to stay out of a lot of these issues. But I think what's happening now is that leaders in business are being given no choice. But I think that, I have to say, that's a really good thing, because I agree with Anne about saying that what has been going on is really in danger of eroding our democracy. And of course, that's not good for business either.
And this all sounds sort of depressing in a way, but what can governments do? What can people do to get everybody, it seems like, even on the same base page on what is truth?
Well, first of all, the EU is becoming very much involved in this, because obviously our democracy should be considered critical infrastructure. It's our political system. It needs to be sustained. It needs to be protected. So we are working very actively to draw up what we call a code of practice for digital companies. It includes, for instance, transparency in who pays for political ads, because
Yes.
a lot of these political ads are not really about informing people. It's only about polarization, dividing us, right? So it's very important that if we have this micro-targeting, this nudging in the run-up to elections, that at a minimum we know who is paying for this, who's responsible for this. You have a situation right now in Brussels where Steve Bannon is setting up shop to rally all the populists in Europe. You think he's doing this with European money? I doubt it. So it's very important to understand, where does this money coming from? And also that companies will be held to account if there are violations. We have now in Europe the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation. Europeans now have real digital rights. You can no longer be targeted, and your data cannot be abused without consequence. And it's really important that we take these steps to preserve the integrity of our electoral systems and ultimately of our democracy. This is not a laughing matter. This is really serious.
I think, and I also think, you know, while I think a lot of big business, the big platforms, have been late, very late, to take part in the conversations, I think there is a happy coincidence right now going on, is that a lot of them have realized that the day that it's the Wild West for the platforms, and that they can stand aloof from this conversation, I think there's a realization, as I say, quite late on, that that needs to change. And I think that's really good, and that these businesses are becoming much more responsible. And so that's what makes me confident about where we're going, because I think it's really important to realize we continue to be at a time of transformation. But I think politics and government and the institutions need to be much more nimble and faster in making decisions, because the opponents of democracy are just all too quick to get there, and we need to move much faster.
Margot, does government need to be more nimble?
I agree with that, and I regret the fact that it seems, you know, if you track back, I guess, to the presidential elections in the US in 2016, and then subsequent elections around the world, including in Europe, that the technology advance has been so rapid that incredible changes and abuse has occurred, and governments have been, I guess, slow to respond by comparison. But I do think it's important that we get our response right. And whilst it is easy for a campaigner to issue a knee-jerk reaction and manipulate and do all this stuff quickly, in order to get our solutions right, because there are very important questions which are coming up on the Twitter feed here about free speech and how we deal with who defines real news. It's quite easy to point the finger at fake news, but when is you know, there's a fine line. So there's a lot of issues to get right, and there is now, I think, I'm pleased to say, a momentum, certainly in the UK and across Europe. I mean, the EU, as Anne was saying, has set out plans to make sure that electoral law must be updated to reflect the new digital reality across the European Union, and we're taking those steps in the UK. We will have fleet of foot, but it is important that we get it right.
I think so much of this is about freedom of speech, incredibly important, but it's the intent. I mean, so much has been said about the alleged, and I think everybody accepts the veracity at this stage, about the Russian involvement in 2016 in the United States. But I think that if you're sitting in the Kremlin, it actually doesn't matter the fact that whether it was Trump or Hillary Clinton got elected. it was game, set, and match to them, insofar as what they brought about was complete chaos in America, where you have this extraordinary polarization. And you can tell from my accent, I'm Irish, but I've been living in America for the last 3 years. And nothing in my life prepared me to see the divides that I'm witnessing in America today. And so much of that came out of the misinformation, the fake news that was created in the lead up to 2016.
And all of that fake news has to live on some sort of platform. So I know that there's movements towards fining some of these tech platforms more, because some of these fines, honestly, are 100,000 pounds. That's nothing for these companies. When are the governments going to get involved and start actually doing something that might hurt a little bit more?
I mean, since the fine you refer to is the British ICO fine on Facebook, of course, £500,000 is derisory. That was the legal upside as to what she could find under the old data protection laws. But the great thing is, thanks to GDPR, which came into force across the European Union at the end of May of this year, and came into force in the UK at the same time, the fining powers are much greater. The maximum now is 4% of global turnover, which even to a company the size of Facebook is significant.
Billions of dollars, yeah.
You know, she has to investigate the illegalities, which there were, under the time at which they took place, which was before May 2018. So that's the reason for that, derisory fine.
And we had a question that just came up here from somebody named Rafa. Can social media also be used for good, to rebuild trust?
Of course, and that was, of course, the initial assumption at the onset of the digital revolution would be that it would strengthen democracy, we would be better informed. However, I note that in the last 12 years, we've had 12 consecutive years of decline in democracy and freedom around the world. It's now a very overriding trend, 12 years with no end in sight. So we must be really careful. This is happening, and illiberalism is coming closer and closer to us. And as we already said, democracies, precisely because we are open, we are so susceptible to it. You know, we don't want to censor. By definition, it's not for us to establish the ministry of truth. However, I also don't believe in free speech for bots and for trolls who do nothing but, spew lies and division and hatred online. And I really think that social media companies had the benefit of the doubt, but pretty much squandered it, I'm sorry to say. So they need to stress test their assumptions much better, because I think we're just seeing the beginning of an onslaught on the trust between us. In the next stage, we will have deep fakes, so audiovisual and audio material that appears real but is in reality fake. And as I said before, the result will be complete disorientation. So we need to prepare for this. And it's really not, it cannot all be done by governments or the companies. People need to understand that this is happening and need to be really, really discerning about what they read, what they hear, and need to understand that the division is essentially part of a political ploy to destroy our democracies. So it's really incumbent on all of us to take it very seriously and to inform ourselves.
John, we've talked a lot about social media companies, and they've obviously are having a trust issue with a lot of people. If you were advising, and I don't know if you do, but if you were advising a social media company, what are the concrete steps you would tell to them on how to improve their image, how people trust them and see them?
Yeah, I mean, one thing I want to say, I think there's also, in all this, I think there is an existential issue going on for journalism as well. And I particularly see it in the United States. And I saw it a huge amount over the last number of weeks. So flicking between CNN and Fox. And I personally would rather see journalists as well getting back to talking about the facts and talking about the issues, and less about opinion. And I think this is a really big commercial issue for the big networks, particularly in the United States. Is there any room or any desire for journalism to live in the center, because Fox has gone one way, and as a result, how does CNN? I know you of course you serve with distinction with, but it's a very big question for them. But in terms of for the rest of us, I think it's very much a question encouraging people to get beyond our own bubble and to reach out and to try and find out what other people are thinking. And one of the things that I feel personally blessed about is that when I went to live in America, I live in the Midwest. I live in St. Louis, and that has helped inform me that a huge swathe of a cross-section of America feels very differently to people on the West Coast or the East Coast, or don't feel in the general come from a liberal thinking background as so many Europeans do. So getting outside one's bubble is incredibly important.
So what do you tell, what would you advise to a government or to Google or anything about what they can do to make people believe in them again?
Well, I think what's happening, apart from what the EU or the British government or other governments might be doing, I think increasingly the danger for a lot of the platforms is that if their users, and particularly young people, see that they are being manipulated by AI, by bots, or by whomever, then they're in danger of losing a lot of their own audience. And I think it's in their self-enlightened interest to be part of the solution rather than on an ongoing basis been part of the problem.
Margot, we have a question here. How can we make sure that regulations don't fall into the wrong hands? And I will add to that, and don't go too far. As Anne said, we don't want to censor speech. Where do you draw that line?
Well, that was what I was saying earlier, that we don't want to, we want to take time to get it right. And it's very important that we don't go from one extreme to another. We don't want to go from the current free-for-all, which doesn't serve anybody. It certainly doesn't serve the public good, let's put it that way, to a system which is overly regulating. But there's no reason why we should worry about that, really. I mean, we have rules and regulations and laws that govern terrestrial broadcasting and the traditional printed press, and they've served well for many years. And I think that we would want companies to take lessons from those editorial decisions and bring into play far more editorial guidance and control over the content that is circulated, certainly during and in the run-up to elections. And I think we need to see a far greater transparency from internet companies over the way that their algorithms work in terms of the dissemination of news on their platforms. At the moment, obviously, we need to use the data protection laws that now exist in Europe. Obviously, that doesn't apply to America, but in Europe at least, to make sure that the micro-targeting of and manipulation of users' data, which is now illegal, we need to make sure those laws are enforced. So we do have laws that can be enforced across Europe. And mindful of the European elections, I'm sure that that will be something that countries and governments want to apply rigorously. But in other regards, we need to make sure that these algorithms that currently reinforce the division, and if you go on YouTube and key in a few keywords, the next load of videos you see will be permanently played towards your choices, and that is a danger because it just reinforces prejudice. So that, I don't believe, can be done without regulation. There isn't, the companies are trying, they're doing stuff. I think John mentioned, they are trying to get on the better side of the argument with some voluntary measures that they're taking, and we welcome those. But we don't see that they will ever go far enough, really, to guarantee the transparency and accountability that public democracies require.
And we're talking a lot about kind of the end stage of regulating these companies. You mentioned education, educating people. What can everybody here do in their everyday lives? What can people do to kind of help fix this from the beginning on the individual sitting at their computer reading, ingesting all of this?
So media literacy is, of course, a big issue, but so is voting. Everyone in this room, I think, is over 18. Turn out to vote. This would be a very good start, you know, if we use the liberties and the freedoms that we have, because, you know, don't take them for granted. The other thing I will say is we need to rethink really the role of media. I am convinced that media is the backbone of democracy. And I think that the business model of media has come too much under pressure. Too much the clickbait, very quick, very fast. And I was intrigued. I recently learned that Apple has a news service now where really it's not algorithms that sort out the news, but humans. Professional journalists, and they don't just use speed, but really their judgment. Is it right? Is this, you know, fake news? Is it real news? And I think we need to really go that way. I mean, not just the speed, not just the clickbait, not just, you know, this. It's where media fails, where you lose the independent media. Essentially, corruption will thrive because there will no longer be those who ask questions, who dig deeper, and who hold public officials to account. So we need to take this seriously. Media is not just another business. It is really the backbone of our democracy. So it is so, so important that we have media that brings us together, because if everything is just spoon-fed what you already believe and what already just reinforces what you know, then democracy will be very difficult to sustain, because we lose the common ground and the compromise and the respect for others' opinions on which democracy is built.
Margot?
I totally agree with what you've said, Anne. And one thing we've done in the UK is we've set up a commission to evaluate the sustainability of the press and what measures we need to do to support the press, the freedom of the press. And our public service broadcaster, the BBC, is empowered and has budget to spread democratic engagement around the country, and that's all to the good. But what we can't necessarily do is, other than accept the fact that large numbers of our populations, certainly people under the age of 35 in the UK, do get the majority of their news from online sources, and they're not necessarily the online versions of the national newspapers. So we, as well as sustaining the traditional press and broadcasters, I heartily agree with that. We're taking measures in the UK to do just that, what you've said. We do need to tackle the issues that challenge us online, because they're not going to go away.
Just very quick, just say one thing that I found out just before I left America that I was enchanted by. I don't have a hard date on it, but I was at a conference and I discovered that in the United States, in a lot of schools right now, they're beginning to teach this and the difference between fake news and real news. And I think this is so important that there is a real need to at least consider having this as part of a curricula in schools.
Heartily agree. Well, on that note, subscribe to your local newspaper and your news service. Pay for quality journalism. It's worth it. That's all the time we have right now. Thank you very much for attending, and thank you to all of our wonderful panelists.